Hi, this is Paul. Time for one more video before I take a red eye tonight out to North Carolina for the South Estuary. I am so looking forward to it. The weather has changed in Sacramento. The black fleece is back on. Might be off a little bit by the end of October, but by November, you'll see it for about 4 months after that. So that's how you can always tell the seasons. Plus, you can always tell I'm not an AI because my hair is different as we go through the year, as some of you will know. So, who got this thing started on the Holy Post? I don't know. But Preston Sprinkle did some recordings at the Holy Post Media Center, and one of his interlocutors was Caitlin. I don't know quite how to say her name. Sheish. I don't want to say it badly. She's written a book. Some publisher sent me the book. I haven't read it. It's over here in the pile of books that publishers send me. Maybe I'll read it someday. Maybe after this I'll read it because I'm curious. But I really like Preston. I've done things with not her. She's an example of something else. But I'm going to listen to the rest of this on the airplane, or at least tomorrow or something like this. But I did a little bit of hunting around for the part that I thought was interesting. And let's start here.
Of it, of like, I think it's actually good for our spiritual formation for us to say, yes, first scripture has taught me these ethical truths. Like, this is not just love immigrants, but there's so much in the Old Testament about how practically to love them and how practically to care for the poor. I'm going to
Now, it's interesting because I've been spending so much time with Orthodox and Catholics that when I listen to her talk this way, I think, wow, she sounds really Protestant and she sounds really modernist, because it's almost like you have all these truths that are hanging out there, and we're going to sort of go up and pluck at these truths and apply them to our lives. And maybe the pastor, and of course I would say the Orthodox Catholics are probably a bit more like, no, we receive this by tradition. But I've got huge questions about tradition because I continue to read The Prisoner of the Vatican, and I continue to be astounded by just how many decades the papacy was fixated on trying to once again reclaim territorial sovereignty over certain parts of Italy. You know, constantly looking to get Austria or France or someone else to intervene to by force take control. And then when you look at moments like, you know, it in the middle of the 19th century, it almost sounded like portions of the French Revolution, but in the center of Italy against specifically the Catholic Church. All of this is to say that these topics are so complex. And even though we have all of these models, whether it's a model of somewhat institutional authority or individuals plucking out and trying to apply, all of these models are models. And I'm not sure to what degree they really get at the hugely messy and difficult way that we actually try to be faithful to God, whether by being loyal subjects of the church. And again, middle 19th century history around the papacy, blowing my mind, just absolutely blowing my mind. I had never knew any of this history. And it just then, I had read that book on Vatican I. I know some things about Vatican II. I can really understand why Vatican II was the way it was. And, you know, with all due respect to my friends like Kale, who are like, Vatican II, everything changed. And I don't have an answer to any of these questions, because are we really going to put people in jail for Catholic prison for thought crimes or for failing to, you know, when Kale's mother talks about keeping the fast on Fridays, and that was just something you never did. Well, that's just sort of generational, that's just generational discipline that was really instilled by the thread of all sorts of things. Now, and then when you turn to, when I look, one of the things that blew my mind just doing all the reading that I have is Jonathan Peugeot went on a video
Great to be with you.
From, this is what happens when you try to control people. It's like, should read some Catholic history. And I'm not letting the Puritans off the hook. I mean, or even the Christian Reformed Church in the early part of the 20th century. I don't think we know our way through this stuff. I really don't. But pretty much everybody in America, and this is Rod Hare's point, pretty much everybody in America, it's got to be voluntary. If it ain't voluntary, it's tyranny, and we're not going to stomach, no matter how right it is, to a degree. But then again, we want rule of law, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of, then there's her. Back to this.
Go to
Maintain
that.
structures that help the immigrant.
Don't harvest the edges of your field so that someone can, all of those like details teach me things about what God cares about, not just for how I individually treat people, but for how human communities should function down to.
And I think that's a good Reformed posture, third use of the law, and Catholics, and, this, I'm in agreement.
Nitty-gritty details. I'll get those general universal truths from Scripture, and I'll also get tons of examples in Scripture of what it looks like to deal with like really messy, tricky issues. Like, what happens when, yes, you have these laws, but the story of Ruth is like a story of like, okay, well, practically, like what happens when we put these provisions in place, but this woman's, husband has died and she's here with her mother-in-law, and actually someone else is supposed to be the redeemer for her. And how does this? So Scripture gives me all of those imaginative examples and these universal truths. And then the really tricky thing is going in the time and place I'm in. How do I be most faithful with the information I have, with how Scripture has shaped and formed me? And I'm most concerned just that we not look for the easiest way out. And I don't think you're doing that, but I think many people hear the policy stuff is complicated, but the Bible is clear, and go, great, I don't have to think as hard, and I don't have to.
Now, I always look at that, I don't have to think as hard, as kind of a cheap shot, not against these people, against this person.
Oh, the reason I say that is because you could go on a Christian college and they have a really solid belief statement, but that's not enough. Now, it could be that they have a very good leadership structure in place where they are enforcing their mission statement and their values in a very solid and good way. But I often find that's not the case. It looks good on paper, but when you start asking very specific questions like okay, here's a scenario. We have a student who comes to the school and they're sexually confused. What protocols are in place for the leadership to handle this in a biblical way?
So basically what she's saying is she can no longer recommend Biola. And it's like, well, I didn't know, U.S. News and World Today, I thought they were the ones that were sort of recommending colleges. No, every podcaster is. PVK, get your list of colleges that you recommend and don't recommend. Don't go to Biola. Maybe go to a state school. It's like, what? Or, and so then you wind up playing this game. And one of the things, I'm going to read some things that I put into a list of tweets this morning responding to some of this stuff, is part of what has happened is that outspokenness itself has become an element of credibility culturally. And it's like, well, I don't compromise. And it's like, I think you're full of shit. I think you do compromise. We all compromise. You get through this world compromising all kinds of things. And again, if you read 19th century papal history, these dudes tried really hard to not compromise. I mean, one of the big issues was after Italy, the new thing called Italy came in and took over Rome and made it his capital, and the king of Italy, I'm just so fascinated right now about the end of the old world, the end of the monarchies, how the First World War causes that all to crash down. And by the end of the Second World War, we are living in a completely different world than we were in 1913. It is just absolutely astounding. But no monarch in Europe, and there's monarchs all over Europe, no monarch in Europe would come and visit the king of Italy in Rome. Now, if he went up to Turin, you might be able to visit him. But if you went down to Rome, the papacy was going to be. And then, of course, who was it? It was Kaiser Wilhelm. Was it the second? I think that's the same one made famous by the rest of history with the boat shoes. And he was, he went down to visit Uberto, and that was sort of breaking the ice. But it's just amazing how the papacy is like begging Austria, well, well, why don't you bring an army in here and reconquer Rome and hold it for us? And, this isn't a new thing. You can read Tom Holland's book about Millennium and find that goes all the way back to Charlemagne, that the Pope needed military muscle, and once he had it, he used it. And, of course, John Calvin used it, of course, too, and Luther used it against the peasant revolts. And as I forget who said it, someone in the corner, but I think it was on Luke's live stream this morning. It was Dave Busatil. He said, there's basically everyone else and then the Anabaptists, because the Anabaptists are like, nope, no use of the sword. And everybody else is like, well, once you have that power. And of course, in some ways, democracy makes this problem a problem for all of us. Because, if it's the monarch, it's like, hey, that godless monarchy can burn in hell. Maybe not for Luke Thompson, but for everybody else, But me, it's not my fault because I'm not the monarch. But you still have to show proper deference and make your vows and follow the monarch, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I was just using her as a negative object lesson. And what's interesting is that the Holy Post, Preston Sprinkle, myself too, in many ways, we're all part of this project that I don't think we ever sort of stated our project, but kind of the idea of this middle. Now, there's a whole bunch of videos I'm comparing Charlie Kirk to Tim Keller. Put me on Tim Keller's side any day. Sorry, true. It's just true. Y'all know me. You've been listening to me long enough. But the project was to gain credibility with what was perceived to be the American mainstream. And I think Sam Tiedemann is exactly right that American mainstream calibrated by, Carol Stream, Illinois, Christianity Today, Russell Moore, Holy Post podcast, that whole thing was Obama 2008. It's right there. I mean, people say, oh, these Christians want to go back to the 50s. No, they want to go back to Obama 2008. And even Sam's talking about the fact he's sort of always a Republican-leaning guy, but he lives in Chicago. And when Obama won the election, he got the tingles. And it was change. And I think, again, Ezra Klein was right in that Obama 2008 was sort of this apotheosis. It was sort of this peak. And after that, the eschaton ended. And we've been living with, we've been living in Trump land, which is kind of cloud world in some ways. But let's keep going.
Do as much.
That's super helpful. I mean, so being, if I can summarize as concisely as I could, everything you're saying, which I agree with, being in exile doesn't remove the Christian from the responsibility of not just loving individuals around them, but also in as much as they have the opportunity, power, and knowledge to address deeper structures that are unjust or sinful or whatever. My not worry, but the question that I raise, because I agree with that, but then I do ask the question.
And then, of course, there's sensibility issues, because I am old enough to remember the 1970s. And if someone saw a young woman wearing a lovely dress, opening her Bible in a comfy chair, a lot of the women I grew up with would say, look at that. She's a cave-in. She's not on the feminist side of history. And of course, you have all these sensibilities, and these sensibilities get attached to all sorts of things, and people react to them. And again, you can listen to Alyssa Childers. It's not biblical. And it's like, the way you throw that word around.
And maybe we've talked about this before. I don't know if we have, but like, how does that not become Christian nationalism? I believe abortion is one of the greatest moral injustices.
And if anybody tried to walk that line, nobody, I think, has been more diligent about trying to walk that line and work that project which I think has completely collapsed. It's Preston Sprinkle, because there's no Woe to you who try to walk down the middle, because you will get shot at by both sides. And that's Preston Sprinkle. And I think Preston has done this with integrity. He has tried to maintain. Now, what he does, oh gosh, let's go back to her, because not them, her.
Because remember, evil isn't stagnant. It's progressive and it's aggressive. And so one of the reasons, I'll just get into this here with Biola, this is what I posted on Facebook. I'll just read this to you and then make some comments. I said, in a recent podcast, I stated that I can't recommend parents send their students to Biola. Many people wrote in and asked me to explain why, and here's a start. So I quoted from Biola's statement on sexuality. You can find this on their website, and I put a link to that in the comments on Facebook. I'll put a link to that in the comments here, or excuse me, the description here. But here's a quote, and I just want to think this through together. But I really encourage you to read the whole thing, but here's just a quote from it. Quote, students desiring to live in Biola-owned housing will be placed based on their sex at birth. However, as issues connected to sexuality and gender are complex and layered, we will walk with students on an individual basis who identify as transgender or experience dissonance with their biological sex and gender in order to provide helpful support to arrive at decisions around facilities use and to offer appropriate accountability. We also, then there's some space, some more things are said. And then at the end of that, it says, we also ask that transgender individuals refrain from the process of a medical transition during their time at Biola, end quote. Let's think this through a little bit. I have a lot of concerns about this statement. First of all, my main concern is how much language it concedes to the language of radical queer theory. The phrase sex.
Concern, fear. I hear it from both sides. To me, it sounded like a well-reasoned statement, because the thing is, you can play your hardlinism and your outspokenness all day long, but when you have someone sitting there in front of you, you're going to have to figure out what is true. One of the most interesting moments in how old Grim Grizz is talking about, at what age do you let the young people know that the world is a mess? I don't know. I think I learned it pretty quick. There was no hiding things in Northside Chapel that the world was a mess when every Sunday you're sitting down with guys trying to recover from heroin addiction. But I remember when my parents actually pointed out to me, one of my junior high teachers, and he was a man. And he had all this facial hair, and he was known, he sang loudly, he was conservative, reformed, very much a Francis Schaeffer sort of reformed guy, would have sort of been on the conservative end of the Christian Reformed Church. My parents showed me his college picture at Calvin College from a 1950s yearbook, and he was a woman there. And I don't know what happened. I don't know if this was a situation where there was a medical problem at birth or an ambiguity or something like that. But clearly, he went to Calvin College in the 1950s as a woman, and I met him by the 1970s as a man. And he went on to have children. I'm pretty sure he was a man. But I don't know what happened to him. And the truth is, when it comes to real life, you're going to have to take, this world is a very broad place. And if you just decide you're going to keep to this line, well, you can do it, but there's going to be costs. And, that's part of why I have respect for hardliners. I really do. Because I think in many ways, the entire ecosystem needs hardliners. Hardliners have their role to play. Hardlinism is not an evil thing. It isn't. And so I have respect for hardliners. I may not be one. And when it comes to deciding things like policy, especially when it comes to people, I think you have to trust the people that you give authority to. And it's just super easy to call them out on your website or on social media and get points for it. And it can look super mushy doing this, but I have a ton of respect for Preston Sprinkle, because Preston Sprinkle wades in there and tries to be faithful to the traditional biblical position and be loving towards people who are at one place or another with respect to it. Love your enemy, love your neighbor, all the way up to and including your enemies, pretty much includes everyone, and figuring out how to live that out and work that out. That's why I've got a lot of respect for Preston. Now, you might disagree, and that's fine. I'll still be your friend if you disagree. I don't have a problem with that. I am friends with truly evil people. And, you know, Preston Sprinkle is not a truly evil person. Alyssa Childers is not a truly evil person. Caitlin Scheiss is not a truly evil pizza. They are all good people, and they are all doing their best to try and figure it out. But
of our day, does that mean we do everything, use whatever means possible, or let's say use Christian means to ensure that justice is accomplished, and try to ban abortion? What about, I won't get, well, do we want to get into foreign policy? I mean, that's most Christians.
Well, and with all of these issues, say, okay, ban abortion. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, we're going to have a ban on it. All right. Are you going to criminalize it? Are you going to criminalize the doctors? Are you going to criminalize the women? What are the penalties going to be for it? And again, I'm not saying you can't or shouldn't do that or figure out how to do that, but the reality is all of those are separate questions you have to answer. And the truth is that when you live in a democracy, a pluralistic democracy like we have, basically you leave it up to the people. Now, again, reading these popes in the middle of the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century, I have a decent amount of respect for what they're dealing with, because they are right in that, well, it's so interesting watching them eventually have to deal with things like newspapers. In the 1849 revolt, where the Papal States revolted and it was finally put down by the Austrians and the French, if you wanted to get word out, you plastered a big piece of paper on a wall somewhere, in a bunch of walls, and people would plaster it over and they'd tear it down. You'd have all this drama around the paper. Can you imagine if Twitter was like that? You'd put it on a wall and people would be, pulling them down and throwing stuff at each other, and you'd have fist fights over by the Twitter wall. Well, that's what you had. But it's interesting because as, again, technology progresses and now suddenly you have these newspapers, and now the papacy has to deal with newspapers. And one of the things you begin to see are these collective spirits that are at work in the culture. And I know, I take a lot of crap around here being a Protestant, and Protestantism leads to atheism. Well, there's a heck of a lot of Catholic atheists in Italy in the middle of the 19th century. They hated the Roman Catholic Church, and they were just as, if they had had the chance to turn cathedrals like Notre Dame into temples of reason, they would have done it. And they were very clear about it. And a lot of that was fomented because you had ideas of liberty, you had ideas of freedom of conscience, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and the Catholic Church was just not down for that. They didn't want it at all. And again, Geneva, Plymouth Bay Colony. I mean, you've got all of those issues, but what develops in America is this vision for a pluralist society. Well, let's let this finish, then I'll read some of my tweets.
Agree with me on my views.
Sure,
but I mean, there's you can go on the list and it's like, well, okay, at the end of the day, what we think is just is based on the Bible. It's Christian justice. So are we trying to fight for a Christian nation? And how is that different than all the Christian nationalists?
Yeah. I mean, I am of the camp that we have way overly broadly defined Christian nationalism.
Okay.
And I think we've done that in part because we're uncomfortable making some of the distinctions we really want to make, in part because we haven't actually been very thoughtful about it. I think sometimes we just kind of go
labels are easy.
Really conservative people claim.
Okay. And the point that I made in yesterday's video is Christian nationalism was a mimetic weapon developed by people sort of on the left in evangelicalism, and to the left of them said, oh, Christian nationalism, we're against that. And then other people were like, oh, wow, that's a cool weapon. I'm going to use that weapon. Actually, Jonathan Peugeot makes this point.
Whatever you develop will be used by your enemy. The culture war has become a little more hot. In general, the jubilation at the return of violence.
Whatever you develop will be used by your enemy. That's exactly right.
Christianity for their political goals is something I don't like, so I will call that Christian nationalism. I won't call it Christian nationalism when, for example, historically, I mean, I had a class of students at Duke Divinity School where we were reading a bunch of articles for 1 week. We spent a week on, it was an Old Testament class, a week on the Old Testament in politics. And all of the articles were about basically like conservative evangelicals in America's history going to the Old Testament for not working on Sundays, for prohibition, for whatever. And some of the students in this class, 22 years old, really zealous, really often coming from evangelical institutions. And
what's so funny about that is if you look at, let's say, the progressive movement in the 19th century. So while you've got the Pope begging, pleading, Austria, please come and reconquer Italy, France, please come and reoccupy Rome. You've got this progressive movement building steam in North America with like, well, I think we got to have child labor laws. And you know what we really got to get rid of? The drink. We got to get rid of the drink. And all of this was part of the progressive movement. And this was pre-fundamentalism. Fundamentalism begins in the beginning of the 19th century. I mean, this wasn't evangelicals were against alcohol. It's just that conservative evangelicals maintained that posture even after prohibition, but it was the left in America that were against alcohol and prostitution and child labor and wanted women's suffrage. And if you dig into that, it's Nancy Percy. I mean, she makes the point that some women were very much against women's suffrage because they didn't want their husbands just sort of becoming irresponsible. And a lot of the temperance movement was about protecting women. And in other words, you take these movements in the 19th century and you bring them to the 20th century. I mean, you can sort of find Doug Wilson back in the 19th century in a lot of positions he has. He's a little bit anachronistic, but he's also like a clever media person. And so he, as long as you keep him to sound bites, it's when you have to actually press him a little bit harder on, okay, well, tell me exactly, first of all, who's going to push your program in Congress? I was like, well, it's going to take 300 years. Yeah, you and the Orthodox, you're waiting for like the 300 and 500 year thing. I don't know what the world's going to look like in 300 or 500 years. Let's keep going.
Wanting to leave that behind, said this is terrible. No one should use the Bible in this kind of way. The Old Testament should not be a blueprint for any political action. You should be Christian in your demeanor and your behavior, but when it comes to your voice in public, you should not be using Christian arguments. You shouldn't be using scriptural arguments.
Again, that Christian in your demeanor and behavior means usually something nice. But lately it's also been like, well, you have to be prophetic. Oh, okay. Well, is that Christian in your demeanor and behavior? Tim Keller got into all of this stuff, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And actually, he just said, why is Christian behavior something that's private and not public? And part of what happened, of course, is sort of this inversion because people began to say, no, we want the government to promote Christian values like Christian immigration policy. And then you just wind up having two Christians fighting over policy differences, which is pretty much what we have now. But both of them coming to it and say, no, we want this to be Christian. It's just that. And again, the point I made in the video earlier this week, they're all liberal Christians, even Doug Wilson. There's nobody on the spectrum right now who is seriously anywhere near the papacy in the 19th century papacy, or even the early 20th century papacy. They just aren't there.
And I said at the beginning of class, like, I want us to put everything we say about this through the lens of, does this make sense of the civil rights movement?
I was just gonna say.
Because
does this make sense of the civil rights movement? Because the civil rights movement was the biggest, last great awakening in American history. It was a moral explosion, and it has become the gold standard by which the broadest spectrum by which people can basically say that is what Christianity looks like. Except, of course, those who say, no, that's just right and wrong. That's not Christianity. And to that, Christians could say, yeah, absolutely. That's just right and wrong. Now, you've got Tom Holland's book Dominion as a massive footnote on it and say, yeah, you're going to have to kind of downstream of Jesus and the church and all of that history. But if you want to believe it's just ontological, amen to that.
because most of the students in that class, and it's not because I think they did everything correctly, but most of the students in this class would say when conservative evangelicals use the Bible in politics, it's bad. When civil rights leaders used the Bible in politics, it was good.
Well, that was a point I brought up at the ETS last year with you. You kicked my butt on it.
And I think that their judgment about those two things is actually correct.
Yeah.
But we're not thoughtful in why.
Yeah.
And so we end up basically saying when people use the Bible for political things I don't like, it's Christian nationalism. And when people use the Bible for political things I do like, it's good, faithful political theology. And what I instead want to say is we should bring the full strength of Christian convictions to public life. And we should not be afraid to say, when I advocate for more compassionate immigration policies, I'm not doing it just because I think that's nice or that it's good for the country. I'm doing it because I think this is not just that God has said individuals should care for immigrants. I think God in the Old Testament has said nations are judged by how they treat foreigners.
Nations. Now, let's because she's working on this exile dissertation at Duke. Need to be Alyssa Childers, but at Duke. Preston's a biblical scholar. You know, a CRC minister who's more CRC than Alvin Plantinga left a comment the other day and says, tell me more about what you mean when you say biblicistic and fundamentalistic. Well, let's look at the biblicistic stuff. You want to look at a biblicistic way? You want to look at anachronism that just slides under the radar all over the place for both sides right now? Look at that funny word, nation. Luke's live stream, and I'm not clipping. I'd love to clip Dave Busatil. Luke, you know, I love clipping Dave Busatil, but it was actually another thing that I thought this is going to make the video today.
Nationalism, all topics that people love and don't get fired up about, and I can't be canceled on.
So I got a take on Christian nationalism, which is different. I think it's a symptom. So the way I think
now, I know some of you don't know who Jedediah is. Let me assure you, Jedediah is not over to the right of much of anything in the rest of this conversation.
It's a symptom is that I feel like if you study history, like there's certain ways that our present moment rhymes with past moments. I feel like if you look at kind of our present moment looks in some ways similar to the 30 Years' War, right? Which would have been, post-Reformation, which was really kind of what gave rise to the modern nation state, right? The Peace of Westphalia, Westphalian state is what they call it, right? Was kind of how Europe moves out of its feudal arrangements into more national arrangements. Capitalism emerges from there. But if you look at kind of some of the deeper undercurrents globally, let's just put it back to the rise of the internet. The internet is kind of a globalizing phenomenon, right? It has us all talking to each other. Borders don't really matter in the same way in cyberspace that they do in physical space, right? And like every major nation on earth right now is having significant trouble retaining a national identity in the face of rapid global change. And so the rise of not just Christian nationalism, but nationalisms, like you can put Christian on as a label of a subset of nationalisms, right? Is they look like to me something more like the signal that we are, it's the symptom that indicates that a system is dying, right? Like I think that part of what is happening is that the internet and related technologies and related supply chain technologies, all of these things that really connect us, actually put incredible amounts of pressure on nation states to retain their identity as nation states and retain sovereign status. What that ultimately gives way to, some people talk about neo-feudalism. There's all kinds of different ways that maybe rearrange global and political power in the future. But I think that the nationalism is just a symptom of a dying system. And
I think he's right. Now, nationalism, again, I've been sort of focusing on papacy, 19th century papacy, and then all the way up into World War I, because again, from before World War I to after the Second World War, so many things about this world is incredibly different. Before, in the 19th century, you have the newspaper, the telegram, the railroad, advances in weaponry, and all of it. Nations are a part of this. And you have all these, it's so interesting because at one point, the Pope is always just trying to get Austria and France to come and, come in with your guns. You might have to kill some of these people that identify as Italian, but take over again and give the power to us. Just again and again, and they say that. And then at some point, the emperor of it used to be the Austrian Empire, then the Austria-Hungary, because the Austrian-Hungary Empire, they just they're just trying to stay on top of this whole thing. And he's like, well, wait a minute, we have a constitution. And it's, it's almost a constitution. No! Can't be, because one of the things that the papacy was really against was, a constitution. And even the monarchs, they didn't want a constitution. Why don't they want a constitution? Because in many ways, the Constitution is held over the monarch and instantiates these things like human rights. Now, again, Doug Wilson will go around and say, well, no such thing as human rights. I want to be a little careful with that. But all of this comes about in terms of the nation. And Jedediah is right in that there's all these things now that are sort of eroding at nations. And when you look at Trump, almost the main thing, his first term, he comes in terms of America first. And then you look at all the dust-ups over immigration issues and things like this. And again, I remember the election, the 2016 election, the campaign there, he wades in and says, immigration. And you gotta hand it to Trump. Trump was very prescient in this. And then immigration, tariffs, and in many ways, Trump is sort of like, let's get back to the 19th century, okay? Let's have tariffs, let's have stronger borders, and you can hear Rod Dreher make this and his love for Hungary. You've got all of these issues going around, but Jedediah is right that the reason there's all this effect on it is that these things are sort of going away. And then, of course, you have experiments in post-nationalism like Canada, the the opposite of America, the twin bizarro brother of America, Canada, and Canada's like, we're a post national nation, and then Trump's like, well, why don't we absorb you? No, we're a nation. Get my flag, elbows up. And Trump single-handedly rejuvenated Canadian nationalism just with a few words, and right after he was elected. So Donald Trump's a powerful man. But I think Jedediah is right that before nationalism, I mean, part of what the papacy was trying to preserve, so let's give them their credit. You were first a Christian. Then after the Reformation, you were first a Catholic or a Protestant. And you just see that eroding bit by bit by bit. It all goes away. And of course, the Catholic Church is like, no, this is our whole game. And now, we're just sort of, and in America, it goes away very early. And the Catholics in America very much become part of the broader culture. And you see this with the woke stuff too, because the woke stuff was really funny in that on one hand, they were anti-national cultural essentialists. And so when she says sort of very simplistically, the nation, because, hey, we find that word nation in the Bible. Doesn't that word nation in the Bible mean the same thing as what we mean by nation now? The ethne, just use the Greek, the ethne. She says, well, what about the ethne? Well, don't use that word. Well, why? Because ethne, ethnic. And then, of course, the strange thing that happens in the New Testament in this multinational culture that is the Eastern Roman Empire is that the ethnes come together in the church. And so, okay, let's give the 19th century popes their due, because they come together in the church. And so it's the brotherhood of man that we employ to ask Austria and France to kill those people that identify as Italian. There's no such thing as Italian, but is there such thing as Austrian or French? Doesn't matter. Look at Austria. They could be Hungarian. They could be Croatian. A lot of them used to be Ottoman. And I'm also reading Sleepwalkers, Christian Clark's book about sort of the stumbling into World War I, in that first chapter about what happens in Serbia. There's this assassination in Serbia in 1908, and it's just brutal. But you've got all these little groups, these Bohemians and the Saxons, and of course Germany's going to collect them. The Prussians are going to sort of take all this, and of course in Italy it's the House of Savoy that's going to take all of this, and then there's going to be, for a while, they're going to be, well, it's all House of Savoy, but then if you're a French monarch or a Austrian monarch and you want to visit the King of Italy, you just can't say King of Italy. You just have to say, well, the House of Savoy, so we'll meet you in Turin, or we'll meet you in Florence, but not in Rome, of course, until Kaiser Wilhelm is like, Rome we go. The German, you gotta love the Germans. Just very, very out there, very bold until, the 20th century. So just slide that word nation in there and hope none of us stop and say, I don't think that means what you think it means. In fact, I think there's just a lot of saying that the United States is a nation like Israel was a nation. Yeah, I heard a lot of that in the 19th century.
And I live in this nation, and my lot is bound up in it. And I both want that for the sake of those individuals, and I want us to be the kind of nation that operates the way God has described nations should operate.
Sounds Christian national to me.
And I don't think I should hide that. I also don't think that I should treat that argument like a trump card against any other kind of argument that can be made in public. So for me, I mean, I maybe I've said this to you before, but one of the most kind of formative experiences I have had, and I learned this in my courses on political theology, but I learned it so much more strongly living in a neighborhood, a pretty low income, high immigrant neighborhood in Durham, North Carolina, where most of my next door neighbors were Muslim immigrant families. And I lived there for 4 years and got to know some of them who lived there the whole time with me. And I will never forget one of my Muslim immigrant neighbors asking me one day if I was a traveling evangelist. And I was like, I don't know why you're asking me that. And she said, you sometimes carry a Bible and you very often are putting a suitcase in your car and leaving for the weekend. And I was like, actually, I thought about it and I was like, I kind of am a traveling. Like I go and talk about Jesus with people in public. But she was thanking me one day for for carrying my Bible, for having a cross around my neck at times. And I was so surprised by that because Durham's a pretty progressive city. And I thought most of the assumptions here are you will think I'm a danger to you because the Christian nationalists, because the angry evangelicals, so why would you, like in progressive Durham, like I shouldn't bring my convictions to bear in public.
I love this story because if you actually live with non-majority culture people, you will learn that the majority culture keeps sending out these public service announcements about what all these non-majority people are like and what they hate and what they distrust. And it's like, well, sometimes that's true. And for some of them, it might be true. But, you know, I've lived amongst African Americans my whole life. And you know what? They're people. A lot of them are conservative. And a lot of them are very much Southern conservative because they came from the South. Read The Warmth of Other Suns. You know, this great migration comes up in the 20th century, and that these were the people I grew up with. These are many of the people that are now I'm ministering to in the last decade of their lives. And you know, I talk about our estuary group here at Living Stones. You know, one of the real treats for people who visit the estuary group is they get a chance to sit with some of these African American women who are in their 70s and 80s now, and they tell their stories, and they're great storytellers, and people just listen because it's not this low resolution, shallow talking points that the majority culture has given you about these people. It's their real lives with all the idiosyncrasies and all the particularities and all of their opinions, because it's like, well, majority culture people get to have opinions, but none of these other minority culture people get to have opinions. They've all got to stick to these stereotypes. And it's like, no.
Life, but my neighbor should. She should wear her head covering and she should give her, but I shouldn't. And she pointed out to me, like, we live in such a progressive city. It's hard to be religious in public. Huh. And she said, you have the choice to be or not. Nothing about Christianity requires you wear a cross around your neck when you leave your house, right, or you carry your Bible. You could put it in your backpack. My religion requires me to.
Some parts of Christianity might say you should wear certain things.
Visibly be religious in public. Wow. And so it's actually like a comfort to me that you are choosing to do that too. It makes me feel less alone.
Wow.
And that to me is a picture of what I would hope would be an alternative to the Christian nationalism that says the Bible says it, that's the blueprint for our nation, and no one else gets a say in it. This is just what it is. The alternative is I want my Muslim neighbor to bring her deeply held convictions about what.
Well, what about no one gets a say in it? Because I know everyone would really like their opponents to shut up and just submit. I get it. But I don't see that happening anytime soon. And you know, everybody threw a fit about Jimmy Kimmel, but he's back on the air. And, you know, there's certainly no gag orders about comics who are sort of taking the piss out of Donald Trump. They're all over the place. But at this point, you have to begin to say things like, okay, well, because a lot of what she's talking about here now is liberalism. And again, as I said before, I don't see anybody on the horizon right now. Even Doug Wilson, when Ross Douthat starts pushing him, there's a lot of liberalism in there. But, you know, part of what's going on in Europe is the question of, can we be so liberal as to vote out liberalism? How does that work? What are do there need to be values rooted in here that actually make society work? For example, let's say that there's immigration and biological multiplication that says she can't go out showing leg. I lived in the Dominican Republic, where to be a Christian man, you don't go out in shorts. To be a Christian woman, you don't wear pants. And a Christian woman doesn't wear lipstick. Now, that wasn't government enforced. It was church enforced. And so this is where these questions get really complicated. And this is where I think Mark Parker sent me a video. He DM'd me on Twitter. And I told him, I said, Mark, I think you're doing us a service by, Mark's, and he took offense when I said Mark's on a tear, but he's on a tear. Mark's on a tear about certain issues, and Mark has generated in the corner this conversation, and I think what we see now is overall the conversation is progressing, and that bit by bit, certain parts of the evangelical talkosphere are now beginning to recognize, oh yeah, I do want Christian values, but we're gonna have to talk about, okay, well, what's the way in which Christians bring their beliefs into society? And let's let her finish, and then I'll read some tweets.
What a faithful, good community looks like to bear on public debate. I want us to go to a city council meeting together and have different ideas about how to best serve the people in our community, hers that are based on her faith and mine that are based on mine. And we will have deep disagreements. We might actually find ways. I mean, I actually think increasingly religious people of different faiths will find some overlap in many ways.
Yeah, the Muslim people are going to have ideas about all kinds of things that a lot of conservative Christians are going to say, yeah, we're with you on that.
But that kind of, I think this is actually truly a Christian practice of hospitality. To say hospitality both requires that I treat your gifts as gifts and not threats to me, but
Now, we're looking at the Old Testament, but let's also be clear that the Moabite who moves into Bethlehem, now it's awful nice if it's Ruth and, she gets together with Boaz and she gets redeemed. That's nice. But what about the Moabite family moving into Bethlehem and saying, Moloch, let's do him. All right, bring in those children. Let's cook them up. I mean, it's been so much fun. The best thing about being a pastor, who, especially after the internet thing, and we have people coming to Living Stones, some of which have never read the Bible before. It is so much fun and so challenging reading the Bible with people that have never read the Bible, especially if they're from deep blue state California, because they're reading through things like the book of Deuteronomy and the book of Joshua, and they're like, yeah, that's in the Bible too. It's really in the Bible. And the nation of Israel is not going to be multicultural when it's a bring in the Moloch. Not going to happen. Even though, you see Gideon chopping down the Asherah pole and, upsetting all of his neighbors. So on one hand, hospitality, the Old Testament, yeah, hospitality, absolutely. But multi-faith in the nation, you're really hard-pressed to find that in the Old Testament. Now, am I saying that should be directly brought here to the United States? No, I'm not saying that. But that is the conversation that people are trying to have.
Hospitality also requires that I'm honest about the place that I am coming from. Like hospitality says, you're welcome into my house. It's my house. Like it looks a certain way and I make certain kinds of food and I'm welcoming the dish you made that smells different and I might never have tasted it before and I don't know what it'll be like. But it doesn't require either that I treat your gifts as threats, or that I hide the particularity of the place that I'm in for the sake of your comfort, because that's not actually real relationship. And I don't think that's real pluralism to say we leave our convictions at the door.
Right.
Real pluralism is, it'll get really messy when I come and say, I think God told us to do this. And you say, I think God told us to do something different. But I think anything less is pretty dishonest. And I don't think it brings the best gifts of our various traditions to bear on the community we now live.
So, we're working through these issues. And I think actually the dread Christian nationalism conversation is progressing. And I think it's progressing in the corner. And I think that's cool. So I get pulled into this, and Donald Trump does his moralistic there. I didn't even listen to this thing.
I don't think there's anything going to get me in heaven. Okay, I think I'm not maybe heaven bound. I may be in heaven right now as we fly an Air Force One. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to make heaven.
You talked about how you hope.
And yeah, moralistic therapeutic deism. This is this sort of this base nominalism that's Christianish underneath the culture. And you see it throughout American history. You see it in Frank Capra movies. You can watch Meet John Doe or It's a Wonderful Life. Here I go. I'm glad Martin Luther King Jr. never quoted the Bible, especially the Old Testament or the prophet Amos on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. That would be Christian nationalism. If we quote Amos on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in what would be a good, important moment of American 20th century history, it's a good thing nobody remembers it's from the Bible. There was once Christian nationalism many moons ago, but that's for the historians. The living religion of the White House today is moralistic therapeutic deism. And again, this is what Reagan and Trump are like. Now, Jimmy Carter, again, was a Baptist school teacher. William Jefferson Clinton, another Southern Baptist. Just ask an LLM, or find a website if you're one of the fundamentalists that doesn't use LLMs, and just have them list out the church affiliations of the American presidents from. You can go from Roosevelt forward. It's a very interesting thing. My engagement with Sam Tiedemann is that moralistic therapeutic deism is sort of a cultural least common denominator nominalism that emerges from religious community standards and assumptions. Churches benefit from this in a religious marketplace because they can differentiate from it in sort of a freemium style mode. It's sort of like Linux, but hey, my Linux distro, and a whole bunch of you don't know what Linux distros are. I'm sorry. It was very nerdish. I'm a little punchy because I got to keep this moving, because I got to see my wife before she has her class, before I get on the plane, before I try and sleep on the plane, which I won't do. And then I try and maybe catch a nap in a car and hopefully don't get roughed up by the good peace officers of Asheville, North Carolina, because I can't get into the hotel room until 3 in the afternoon. And I'm going to eat barbecue at 2. And then I'm going to we'll see how tomorrow goes. Everyone has mushy ideas about morality or the afterlife, but our brand has the more concrete notions plus the receipts to plead our own particulars. For the sake of peace, we'll get along with the broader marketplace of ideas, because civility and conversation in the marketplace actually help us further our goals of trying to attract more people to our particular room in the C.S. Lewis Mere Christianity hallway. And then, of course, I note the Tim Keller clip. I think Sam is also right that when some basic long-standing religious agreements, especially regarding human sexuality, change, plus the demand that all, see pressure on Christian institutions like colleges, conform to the new idea, that's when the go-along-to-get-along spirit broke down. To some degree, the civil rights movement has a similar challenge, see Bob Jones University and the IRS, but the civil rights movement was such a massive awakening event, and so overtly Christian at a time when church attendance and alignment was at a peak in American history. It carried the day. Yet overt racism would not be tolerated. Wokeism didn't have the power, and as racism definitions continued to creep, it all sort of blew apart. And again, if you want to read a really good piece. It's a few years old now, posted 2017, against murderism, which basically goes into the definitions of. He starts with it's a good piece. I'll put the link below. But it shows that you just throw out this word racism. Well, what exactly do you mean by this? And you see this right now with, well, Charlie Kirk was a racist. Well, what exactly do you mean by a racist? No, don't bog me down in the particulars. I'm liberating people from their evils right now. Me and my secular spirit. Now here comes the spice. The currently caving element of evangelical elites, Christianity Today, Holy Post, CRC, Calvin University, exiles, have long been playing by a set of rules within that religious marketplace in order to gain supremacy, to unseat the declining mainline. Their set of rules was 5 years ago. So decried as winsome. They wanted to signal broadly that they were good people according to the evolving rules of a broadly Tom Hollandish Christian arena, hoping, as with everyone else, to gain an audience. They were going to be the American political moderates. Don't talk too loudly about abortion, and definitely not prayer in public schools, etc. And you will gain credibility in the middle of that space, hopefully to win people to your particularity, which is pretty moderate evangelicalism. Welcoming Catholics that weren't going to go too hard in the paint on Mary or purgatory. As Sam Tiedemann again lived out with all the collapsing of same-sex marriage. What has happened in the Christian Reformed Church is a microcosm of the much larger arena. I know that because was one of those before that in that space collapsed. Right now, there's no momentum in that space. They remind me of the papacy in the middle to late 19th century, really imagining they were going to try to get the papal states back. This is what the exile of CRC friends and high-profile Calvin University profs. It's such a sad story. And then in my trollishness, I played, and I'm not going to play it here because I see dead people. They don't know they're dead. They can't see each other. And that's kind of sort of that middle space. I think it's true. The conversation has continued to evolve, and I think actually, okay, so who is gaining the upper hand? Who has momentum? Who has traction? Well, this weapon, this mimetic weapon of Christian nationalism was deployed. The other side took it and ran with it. And I think overall the conversation is progressing. And I think that's a good thing. So that's it for this video. Leave a comment. And for some of you, I'll see you in Southeastuary. Will there be videos from Southeastuary? Will there be new membership videos? There won't be a Friday live stream. We'll see. Leave a comment.